At first, it sounded thoughtful. That was what made everything afterward feel so terrifying. Michael said it casually one rainy afternoon while helping me carry groceries inside. "You should share your location with me," he said. "Just in case." Just in case, 3 small words, harmless on the surface, reasonable even. After Richard died, everyone worried more, I knew that. So at first, I said yes without thinking much about it. Normal family concern, normal modern technology. That was what made the realization later feel so humiliating. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows while Michael set grocery bags onto the counter. He took my phone gently and walked me through the steps. See. Now if anything happens, I'll know where you are. Anything happens. Interesting phrase, not if you get a flat tire, not if your phone dies, anything. Vague fear disguised as preparedness. Still, I ignored the strange feeling tightening quietly in my chest. Because grief changes families, everyone becomes protective afterward. That was what I told myself. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 weeks earlier, Sandra casually asking, "You made it home okay from the store?" At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, maybe she already knew exactly when I got home. The thought flickered briefly through my mind before disappearing again. I did not want to think that way yet. Then Michael smiled softly and handed my phone back. There, easier now. Easier, interesting word, not safer, not comforting. Easier for who? The question lingered quietly inside me long after he left. At first, nothing seemed strange. Life continued normally. Doctor appointments, grocery shopping. Quiet afternoons listening to Richard's old jazz records while rain moved softly across the windows. Normal life. Then small moments started accumulating. Odd little comments. Sandra calling casually, "You're at the pharmacy," I froze instantly. "How did you know?" Silence, tiny silence. Then too quickly, "You mentioned it earlier." But I had not. I remembered that suddenly with perfect clarity after hanging up. The realization sat cold and heavy in my chest. Then another memory surfaced. Michael texting one afternoon, "Traffic bad near downtown." I stared at the message while sitting motionless at a red light downtown. The world seemed to narrow instantly around the glowing phone screen. How did he know where I was? Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. He was checking, not occasionally, regularly. The thought made me physically ill. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Claire casually saying last week, "You've been going to the cemetery a lot lately." At the time, I assumed Michael told her after conversations. Now everything rearranged itself differently again. Not conversations, observation. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. My movements had quietly become family information. That was the humiliation, not safety, visibility. I suddenly realized something devastating. For weeks now, my children may have known where I was before I even spoke to them. That thought hollowed me completely. Rain battered softly against the car windows while I sat frozen at the red light downtown. Then another memory surfaced. Richard once calling me 3 times because I forgot my purse at a restaurant. Everyone laughed affectionately afterward. No tracking, no monitoring, no invisible maps showing my movements, because middle-aged mistakes remain socially human. Elderly vulnerability becomes technologically observable. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. Every detour, every stop. Every cemetery visit, potentially visible. The thought made my skin crawl. Then Michael texted again. "Everything okay?" The light turned green. Cars behind me honked softly. Yet I remained motionless for several long seconds staring at the message. Because suddenly, I understood something devastating. My son was not simply waiting for updates from me anymore. He was watching for them himself. That was the shift, not communication. Surveillance softened by love. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last Tuesday, Sandra casually asking, "Still at Mrs. Ellis's house?" I had never told her I went there. The realization hit so fast my chest tightened painfully. Not guesses, not coincidence. Checking, they were checking. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. For weeks, I whispered internally, my family has known where I am without asking me. The thought made ordinary life suddenly feel contaminated somehow, not because I was hiding anything. Because privacy quietly stopped belonging entirely to me anymore. Then another memory surfaced. The night Richard died, Michael whispering, I can't lose you too. God help me. Maybe everything afterward truly started there. Not technology, not tracking, fear. One devastating loss quietly teaching my children that uncertainty itself had become unbearable. That did not erase the humiliation. But finally, it explained why love now felt so watchful all the time. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. Michael probably believed checking my location constantly proved how deeply he cared. That somehow made everything sadder. No cruelty, no manipulation. Just terrified love quietly transforming into observation. I drove slowly home through rain-darkened streets while nausea rolled heavily through my chest. Then I quietly admitted something devastating for the first time. I no longer felt alone when I was alone. And suddenly, I understood something terrifying. The most painful part of growing older is not that people worry about your safety. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly transform ordinary care into constant visibility. Once the people who love you become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you. After that day, I started noticing the checks everywhere. That was what terrified me most. Not one coincidence, not one message. A pattern. Once I finally recognized it, I could not stop seeing it. Michael texting, busy at the store today, while I stood inside the grocery store parking lot. Sandra casually calling, you're near the cemetery again, while rain slid softly across my windshield outside Richard's grave. Claire saying, you've been driving farther lately. Without me ever mentioning where I had gone, every comment suddenly rearranged itself differently again. Not conversation, monitoring. That was the humiliation. My movements no longer fully belonged to me. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. For weeks, I whispered internally one evening, my family has known where I am before hearing my voice. The thought hollowed me completely. I sat quietly at the kitchen table while Richard's old jazz records played softly through the house. Rain tapped against the windows again. Always rain lately. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 3 months earlier, Sandra asking, you got home safely. At the time I thought she was being thoughtful after dark. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, she probably already saw I was home. The question was not protection. Confirmation. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. My children no longer waited for communication from me naturally. They checked first. That was the shift. Not connection, verification. I stared down at my phone resting silently beside my coffee mug. Tiny device. Tiny blue location icon. So much fear hidden inside something so ordinary. Then another memory surfaced. Richard once driving to the wrong grocery store entirely after a stressful week. Everyone laughed affectionately afterward. No tracking, no invisible maps. No quiet emotional surveillance. Because middle-aged mistakes remain socially human, elderly unpredictability becomes emotionally loaded. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Then Michael called suddenly. I answered carefully, too carefully. Again, Michael noticed immediately. You sound tense. Tense, interesting word, not uncomfortable, not hurt, tense. Even emotional reactions now quietly sounding clinical somehow. I closed my eyes briefly. How often do you check it? Perfect silence answered me. Heavy silence, not confused silence. Caught silence. Then Michael whispered softly, just sometimes. Sometimes, interesting word, not rarely, not when worried, sometimes, the vagueness itself answered everything. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. There was no emotional boundary around the checking anymore. No emergency threshold, no specific concern, just access. That was the real tragedy. Fear repeated often enough eventually transforms possibility into entitlement. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last week, sitting alone near the lake for nearly an hour because I missed Richard so badly I could barely breathe. Michael texted afterward, "You've been parked a while. Everything okay?" The memory hit so fast my chest tightened painfully. Not intuition, not coincidence, observation. My private grief had quietly become visible data. That realization nearly broke me. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. I no longer knew which moments of solitude actually belonged only to me anymore. The thought made ordinary loneliness suddenly feel exposed somehow. Then Michael whispered softly through the phone, "We just worry." There it was again, perfect honesty, not control, not manipulation, fear. One devastating loss quietly teaching my children that uncertainty itself had become emotionally intolerable. That did not erase the humiliation. But finally, it explained why they sounded so frightened all the time. Then another memory surfaced. The night Richard died, Michael whispering, "I should have checked on him sooner. God help me." Maybe everything afterward truly began there. Not with technology, not with tracking. Guilt. One devastating loss quietly convincing my children that constant awareness might prevent future tragedy. That was the tragedy underneath everything. Fear had quietly transformed observation into moral responsibility. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. Michael probably believed checking my location constantly proved devotion. That somehow made everything sadder. No cruelty, no manipulation. Just terrified love quietly replacing trust with visibility. Then I quietly asked, "Do you know what frightens me now?" Michael went silent briefly. "What? I think before going places." My voice cracked slightly. "I wonder who will see." Perfect silence filled the phone line afterward, because there it was. The deepest wound underneath everything. Not safety. Self-conscious existence. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to experience ordinary movement like ongoing observation. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Driving aimlessly some nights after Richard died because grief felt too large for the house. Not because I was lost, because motion hurt less than stillness. God help me, those drives no longer felt private now. That was the real tragedy, not tracking itself. The quiet erosion of unseen humanity. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke my heart. "I didn't realize it would stop feeling like your life." The sentence settled heavily through the quiet house, because finally he understood the actual damage underneath everything, not technology. Constant visibility. Fear had quietly followed me into solitude itself, and suddenly I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people want to know you are safe. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly convince the people who love you that they should always know where you are. Once they become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you. After that conversation, I almost turned the location sharing off immediately. Almost. That was what frightened me most, not that Michael tracked me. That part of me already felt guilty for wanting privacy back. I stared at the little blue location icon on my phone late that night while rain tapped softly against the bedroom windows. Tiny symbol. Tiny setting, yet somehow powerful enough to quietly change how I experienced solitude itself. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. "For weeks," I whispered internally, "I've been behaving like someone who is being observed." The thought hollowed me completely. I remembered small moments suddenly differently. Pausing outside stores before changing destinations. Feeling strangely self-conscious during long drives. Texting family explanations before anyone asked questions, not because I owed explanations. Because somewhere deep down, I already assumed someone might be watching the map. That was the tragedy. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to narrate themselves preemptively. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last Thursday, sitting alone beside the lake for nearly an hour after crying in the cemetery. Michael texted, "Everything okay?" At the time I felt touched. Now my stomach tightened painfully. No, my grief had quietly become visible movement data. Everything rearranged itself differently again. Not concern, monitoring. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. Even my silence no longer belonged fully to me anymore. The thought made ordinary loneliness suddenly feel contaminated somehow. Then Sandra called the next morning. Her voice sounded careful lately. Not clinically careful, emotionally careful, the difference mattered. "You awake already?" Simple question, at least once. Now my stomach tightened automatically, not because Sandra sounded manipulative, because suddenly every interaction carried invisible awareness underneath it. I answered quietly. "Yes." Then Sandra paused briefly before saying, "You drove pretty far last night." The room seemed to narrow instantly around those words. Not, "How are you feeling?" Not, "Did you sleep okay?" Location first. I stared silently toward the rain-darkened kitchen window. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard once disappearing for 6 hours after an argument because he drove around clearing his head. Everyone laughed afterward when he returned with fast food. No tracking, no invisible maps. No emotional panic attached to movement itself. Because middle-aged unpredictability remains socially human, elderly unpredictability becomes emotionally threatening. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. My children no longer experienced uncertainty neutrally. Every unknown location now carried catastrophic possibility underneath it. That was everything. Sandra whispered softly through the phone, "We got worried." We, interesting word, not "I got worried." We, collective monitoring, shared observation. I suddenly imagined my children discussing my movements privately. She stopped near the cemetery again. She drove around late. She stayed parked too long. The thought made me physically ill, then another memory surfaced. Last month, Claire casually asking, "You still taking the same route home?" At the time, I thought she worried about traffic. Now everything rearranged itself differently again, not conversation. Pattern tracking. Then another horrifying realization surfaced. My routines had quietly become emotionally monitored systems inside my family's minds. That was the deepest humiliation underneath everything. I looked down at the phone resting beside my coffee cup. Then another realization surfaced slowly. The location sharing itself was not the real issue anymore. The issue was that fear had already transformed my children's relationship with uncertainty completely. No unanswered calls. No unexplained detours. No long silences. Everything required visibility now. Then Sandra whispered something that nearly broke my heart. After Dad died, not knowing where someone is became terrifying. There it was finally, perfect honesty, not control, not manipulation, trauma. One devastating loss quietly teaching my children that uncertainty itself had become emotionally dangerous. That did not erase the humiliation. But finally, it explained why visibility now sounded like love to them. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. The night Richard died, Michael whispering, "I should have checked on him. God help me." Maybe everything afterward truly began there. Not technology, not location sharing. Guilt. One devastating loss quietly convincing my children that constant awareness might prevent future tragedy. That was the tragedy underneath everything. Fear had quietly transformed observation into emotional responsibility. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. And worse, part of me had already started accepting that logic too. That frightened me most of all. I remembered apologizing automatically recently for stopping unexpectedly somewhere. Not because I owed explanations, because somewhere deep down, I already assumed my movements required interpretation. God help me, I had already started living transparently. That was the real tragedy, not tracking, the quiet erosion of unseen existence. Then Sandra whispered softly, "We thought sharing your location would make you feel safer too." Safer. Interesting word, not freer, not respected. Safer. Fear always offering protection first while quietly shrinking autonomy underneath it. I stared toward the rain, sliding softly across the kitchen windows, then quietly admitted something devastating for the first time. I missed disappearing for a little while without anyone becoming afraid. Sandra cried softly on the other end of the line, because finally she understood the actual damage underneath everything. Not the app, not the map, the quiet loss of unobserved humanity. And suddenly I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people worry about where you are. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly convince the people who love you that they should always be able to find you. Once they become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you. A few days later, I turned the location sharing off for 1 hour. Just 1 hour. That was all. Not to hide anything, not to punish anyone, just to sit beside the lake without feeling visible. The decision alone made my hands tremble slightly. That frightened me, because suddenly privacy felt rebellious somehow. I stared at the phone screen while rain moved softly against the car windows parked near the water. Tiny button, tiny choice, yet my chest tightened like I was about to do something wrong. God help me. I had already started treating solitude like suspicious behavior. That was the real tragedy. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to feel guilty for wanting unobserved moments. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard disappearing for long drives after stressful days. Everyone accepted it naturally. He needs space, people said. No tracking, no panic, no emotional surveillance. Because middle-aged solitude remains socially normal, elderly solitude becomes emotionally loaded. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. I pressed the button. Location sharing paused. And instantly silence felt different somehow. Larger, cleaner. Mine. I sat beside the lake listening to rain tap softly across the windshield while fog drifted slowly above the water. No questions. No invisible checking. No one quietly observing movement patterns. Just grief. Human grief. And for the first time in months, I did not feel visible while missing my husband. That realization nearly made me cry. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. I had forgotten what emotional privacy actually felt like. The thought hollowed me completely. Then my phone rang. Michael, of course. The sound shattered the quiet instantly. I stared at the glowing screen while my stomach tightened painfully, not because I feared him. Because suddenly I realized how quickly absence itself now triggered fear inside my family. I answered carefully. Too carefully. Again. Michael sounded panicked immediately. Why did your location disappear? No hello. No how are you? Location first. The room inside my chest seemed to collapse inward slightly. I looked out toward the rain-darkened lake. Then quietly answered, I turned it off. Perfect silence followed, heavy silence, fearful silence. Then Michael whispered softly, why, interesting word, not okay, not you're allowed. Why, as though invisibility itself now required explanation. That was the humiliation. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Sandra calling last month because I stayed too long at the cemetery. At the time I thought she sensed something emotionally. Now everything rearranged itself differently again. Not intuition. Map watching. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. My family no longer interpreted unavailable information neutrally. Every gap now carried danger. That was everything. Michael whispered carefully, we got worried. We again, always we. Collective observation quietly normalized into family culture. I closed my eyes briefly while rain moved softly across the windshield. I just wanted an hour. The sentence settled heavily through the silence. 1 hour, such a tiny thing, yet suddenly emotionally enormous. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke my heart. You disappeared. There it was, perfect truth. Not you needed space. Not you wanted privacy. Disappeared. Fear had quietly transformed temporary invisibility into emotional catastrophe. Then another memory surfaced. The night Richard died, nobody knew exactly where he was for hours before the hospital called. God help me, maybe everything afterward truly began there. Not with technology, not with maps, trauma attached to absence itself. One devastating loss quietly teaching my children that not knowing where someone is can destroy your life forever. That did not erase the humiliation. But finally, It explained why visibility now felt emotionally mandatory to them. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. Michael probably genuinely experienced checking my location as love. That somehow made everything sadder. No cruelty, no manipulation. Just terrified devotion quietly replacing trust with constant awareness. I stared toward the fog drifting across the lake, then quietly asked, "Do you know what hurts most?" Michael stayed silent. I didn't even realize how trapped I felt until the map disappeared. Perfect silence answered me afterward, because there it was, the deepest wound underneath everything, not technology. Conditional freedom. Fear had quietly transformed ordinary movement into emotionally supervised existence. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Apologizing automatically recently for taking longer routes home, not because I owed explanations, because somewhere deep down, I already assumed my movement required justification. God help me. I had already started narrating my life around invisible observation. That was the real tragedy. Not aging, internalized visibility. Rain moved softly across the windshield while Michael finally whispered, "I don't know how to stop being afraid." The sentence settled heavily through the car. Because finally he sounded like my son again instead of my observer. Not controlling, not suspicious, terrified, and suddenly I realized something devastating. My children were not trying to imprison me emotionally. They were trying desperately to build a world where nobody they loved could disappear unexpectedly ever again. But somewhere inside that fear, they quietly stopped understanding the difference between knowing where I was and actually trusting me to still belong fully to myself. Then I quietly admitted something devastating for the first time. I miss being somewhere without feeling emotionally accounted for. Michael cried softly on the other end of the line. Because finally he understood the actual damage underneath everything, not the location sharing itself, the quiet loss of invisible existence. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people want reassurance you are safe. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly convince the people who love you that they should always be able to find you. Once they become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you. After that day at the lake, things changed slightly, not dramatically, just enough to hurt differently. Michael stopped mentioning my location directly. Sandra asked fewer questions about where I had been. Claire stopped casually referencing places I never told her about. Yet somehow the silence around the tracking became heavier than the tracking itself. That was the damage. Once visibility becomes emotionally normalized inside a family, everyone feels the absence of it afterward. I noticed it immediately. Longer pauses before phone calls. Tiny flickers of relief when I answered quickly. Subtle tension whenever I did not respond for several hours. Fear remained alive even without the comments. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard once disappearing for an entire afternoon after a fight because he drove aimlessly near the coast. Everyone laughed about it afterward. He needed to clear his head. No panic, no tracking. No invisible maps refreshing quietly in someone's pocket. Because middle-aged distance remains emotionally acceptable. Elderly distance becomes frightening. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Rain tapped softly against the windows while I folded laundry alone one evening. Then my phone buzzed. Michael. I stared at the screen for several long seconds before answering. Not because I feared him, because suddenly every phone call carried invisible emotional monitoring underneath it. I answered softly. "Hi," Michael sounded careful lately. Not clinically careful, emotionally careful, the difference mattered. "How was your day?" Simple question, at least once. Now my stomach tightened automatically, not because the question itself sounded threatening, because fear had already retrained my body. I answered quietly. "Fine," too short. I heard it myself instantly. Michael heard it too. Silence lingered softly between us. Then he whispered, "You still upset about the location thing?" Thing, interesting word. Not the tracking. Not the monitoring. Thing, fear always softening language around itself. I closed my eyes briefly while rain moved softly across the glass. It's not just the app. Perfect silence answered me. Because somewhere deep down, Michael already understood that. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. The map had never really been the issue. The issue was what the map represented emotionally. Constant accessibility, continuous visibility, quiet reassurance through observation. That was the shift. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Last month, apologizing automatically because I stopped for coffee unexpectedly. Not because I owed explanations. Because somewhere deep down, I already assumed deviations might alarm someone watching. God help me. I had already started organizing my life around invisible emotional supervision. That was the real tragedy. Fear repeated often enough eventually teaches older adults to move through life, as if someone else quietly needs updates about their existence. Then Michael whispered softly, "I thought it would make you feel protected." Protected. Interesting word, not trusted, not respected, protected. Protection always sounds loving until it quietly begins replacing autonomy. I stared toward Richard's photograph glowing softly beneath the hallway light. Then another memory surfaced. The night Richard died, Michael whispering, "If I had checked sooner, God help me, maybe everything afterward truly began there." One devastating loss quietly teaching my children that awareness equals safety. That illusion poisoned everything slowly afterward. Because awareness cannot stop death. Tracking cannot erase grief. Visibility cannot guarantee permanence. Yet fear still reaches for those things anyway. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. My children were not actually trying to control me. They were trying desperately to control uncertainty. That was everything. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke my heart. "When your location disappeared, I couldn't breathe for a minute." The sentence settled heavily through the quiet room, because finally I understood the emotional reality underneath all of it. Not suspicion, panic, raw panic attached to absence itself. That realization softened something painful inside me briefly, not enough to erase the humiliation, but enough to finally understand its shape completely. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Standing beside the lake during that 1 hour alone. No visibility, no emotional accounting. No invisible observation. Just rain, water, grief, human grief. And suddenly I realized how desperately I missed existing privately. Not secretly, privately. There was a difference. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. Fear had quietly convinced my family that uninterrupted access to me emotionally equaled love. That was the tragedy underneath everything. Not technology, boundary collapse. Then I quietly admitted something devastating for the first time. I think all of you stopped realizing I still need parts of my life that belong only to me. Perfect silence answered me afterward, because there it was, the deepest wound underneath everything. Not location sharing, the quiet erosion of unobserved humanity. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Richard sitting alone in the garage for hours after difficult days listening to baseball games on the radio. Nobody tracked him. Nobody monitored his movements. Nobody feared silence itself. Because middle-aged solitude remains emotionally safe, elderly solitude becomes loaded with possibility. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Rain moved softly across the windows while Michael finally whispered, "I forgot privacy can still matter even when someone is vulnerable." The sentence nearly broke me completely. Because finally he understood the actual damage underneath everything. Not fear itself, fear replacing dignity, and suddenly I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people worry when they cannot reach you. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly convince the people who love you that your life should remain continuously visible. Once they become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you. A week later, I turned the location sharing back on. That might sound strange after everything, but this time I did it differently, not automatically, not silently, intentionally. That distinction mattered. Michael came over Sunday afternoon while rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows again. Always rain lately. We sat at the table drinking coffee from Richard's old mugs while silence moved gently through the room. Not tense silence this time, thoughtful silence. Then I placed my phone between us. Tiny device, tiny blue location icon, so much fear hidden inside something so ordinary. Michael looked down immediately. You don't have to turn it back on. Have to, interesting phrase. Not I want you to, not please do, have to. For the first time in months, his voice sounded less like fear and more like guilt. I stared quietly at the phone. Then softly said, I don't mind sharing where I am. Michael looked up slowly. But I need you to understand something. The room stayed completely still except for rain against the windows. I still deserve places that belong only to me emotionally. Perfect silence answered me, because there it was, the deepest truth underneath everything. Not technology, not safety, personhood. I looked toward the rain-darkened backyard. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Standing beside the lake during that one private hour while fog drifted softly over the water. No tracking. No invisible observation, just grief. Human grief. That hour had reminded me something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. I was still allowed to exist privately, even now, especially now. Then another memory surfaced. Richard disappearing into the garage for hours listening to baseball games after hard days. Nobody tracked him. Nobody monitored silence itself. Because middle-aged solitude remains emotionally acceptable, elderly solitude becomes frightening. That was the cruel difference underneath everything. Michael stared down at his coffee mug quietly. Then whispered, I think after Dad died, every unanswered call started feeling dangerous. There it was again, the real origin underneath everything, not technology, not monitoring, trauma. One devastating loss quietly teaching my children that uncertainty itself had become emotionally catastrophic. That did not erase the humiliation. But finally, it explained why visibility now felt emotionally necessary to them. Then another horrifying realization surfaced slowly. My children were not really afraid of where I was. They were afraid of not knowing. That was everything. Fear had quietly transformed uncertainty into emotional emergency. Then Michael whispered something that nearly broke my heart. When your location disappeared that day, his voice cracked slightly, I realized how terrified I still am. Terrified, not controlling, not suspicious, terrified. For the first time in months, I stopped hearing observation in his voice and heard grief instead. That changed something inside me, not enough to erase the damage, but enough to finally understand its shape completely. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. The night Richard died. Michael sitting in the hospital hallway staring at the floor whispering, I should have checked sooner. God help me. Maybe everything afterward truly began there. One devastating loss quietly poisoning the family's relationship with absence itself. Then another realization surfaced slowly. And maybe that was why the tracking hurt so deeply. Not because my children wanted control, because fear quietly convinced them visibility equals love. That was the tragedy underneath everything. Then I reached for the phone slowly. I'll share my location. Michael looked up immediately, but not because I owe constant access to my life. The room stayed perfectly still. Because I understand why you're afraid. The tears filled Michael's eyes instantly. Because finally both of us understood the same devastating thing. This was never really about technology. It was about grief quietly reshaping the emotional boundaries inside a family until love and observation became tangled together. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, lately wondering whether older adults slowly disappear emotionally by inches before anyone notices. Not physically, narratively, one tiny shift at a time. People checking first instead of asking, monitoring instead of listening, watching instead of trusting. That was the real tragedy. Then Michael quietly admitted something devastating. I forgot you can still need privacy without hiding anything. The sentence settled heavily through the kitchen, because there it was, perfect truth, Privacy is not secrecy. Solitude is not danger. And grief does not erase personhood. Rain moved softly across the windows while jazz played quietly from the living room radio. Then another realization surfaced slowly. For the first time in months, the location sharing no longer felt like surveillance, because finally there was language around it, boundaries around it, recognition around it, not silent observation. Mutual understanding, that changed everything. Later that evening, after Michael left, I stood alone beside the rain-darkened kitchen window while Richard's photograph rested softly beneath the hallway light. Phone beside me. Blue location icon glowing quietly. Yet somehow I no longer felt trapped by it, because finally I remembered something essential. Being loved does not mean surrendering every invisible part of yourself. And suddenly, I understood something devastating. The most painful part of growing older is not that people worry when they cannot find you. It is realizing how quickly fear can quietly convince the people who love you that constant visibility is the same thing as closeness. Once they become terrified, they might already be slowly losing you.